Hello, this is Eric Guindon. I'm the author of The Reluctant Messiah, a book I have self-published through the Amazon Kindle platform. There will be a link at the bottom of this video to bring you to the appropriate fan pages, etc. I am creating this video, which is admittedly more a sound file than anything else, to give you a chance to get a preview of the book. I am going to read you the beginning of the first chapter. Chapter 1. Bernard. Bernard was nervous about the meeting. He didn't know what these people were like, but he'd seen the ad on the bulletin board at a Starbucks and had been curious enough to check it out. The ad had read, "The apocalypse is nigh. The Messiah is already among us. We must prepare for the great works he will bring. He will break us and remake us. Join now and prepare for the rapturous times ahead." There followed some contact information which Bernard had written down. The ad had used too many exclamation marks to be taken seriously, but it had intrigued him. He had been looking for something he could do that would put a dent in his parents' lack of interest in him and what he did. They had an approach to parenting that bordered on criminal indifference, and he desperately wanted to do something that might get them to pay attention to him. He had found out this was a tall order through previous attempts. He had tried staying out all night without letting them know where he had been, but the next morning they greeted him casually over breakfast as if nothing had happened. He later realized they hadn't even noticed he had not been home. He had then tried absenting himself for longer periods, a weekend here and there, all without eliciting a single raised eyebrow. Before seeing the ad for the meeting, he had been considering hiding at a friend's house for a week, just to see if either of his parents would even notice his absence. He knew that going to the meeting was taking his life into his own hands. The nut bars at the meeting might abduct or kill him, but he was a little bit desperate, and he didn't seriously think there was a high probability of danger. The probability was higher than zero, but he didn't judge it to be significantly so. To him it felt like living on the edge, like doing something risky. He hoped it would be something that might even get his parents to take notice. "It would serve them right if these people turned out to be Satanists and they sacrificed me tonight," he thought as he walked from the bus stop near the address he'd gotten when he'd called the number from the ad earlier that day. The call itself had been strange. The phone had rung and a woman had answered, but he could barely hear her over the background sounds of young children playing and screaming. "What?" The woman pretty much screamed into the phone to be heard above the noise. Hello?" he'd said hesitantly. "Speak up! What do you want?" She didn't seem to have a lot of patience. He hadn't expected the contact number to be answered by someone so belligerent. He thought he might have dialed the wrong number. I might have the wrong number. I'm calling about the..." He hesitated there because he didn't want to say words like cult or apocalypse to some random woman. It was one thing to call out the people who had put up the ad, but talking like that to someone else would be embarrassing. He was beginning to think this was all a ridiculous idea, and that he should not have called, when the woman's tone brightened up. "Oh, you're calling about the ad!" She sounded rather surprised and excited. She proceeded to give him the address, making sure he got it right, and then telling him how excited she was that the group would have some new blood. Bernard wasn't sure if he could imagine this woman as some Satanist or murderer, but the new blood reference gave him chills. It brought the wrong sort of imagery to mind. He'd spent the hours between the call and the meeting debating with himself whether he should go or not. In the pros column, he had such entries as, "It will piss off the parents," "Meet interesting people," "Find out about apocalypse and or Messiah." In the cons column, he had "Get killed by crazy people," "Meet boring people." Here, boring stuff about a supposed apocalypse and related bogus Messiah. In the end, pissing off his parents won the toss-up, and Bernard headed out to the meeting, but not without some trepidation. When he arrived at the designated address, his fears about being killed by the cultists were put to rest, along with any hope he had that the evening was going to be filled with any revelations or any content that would be upsetting to his parents. The meeting place was a community meeting hall in the basement of a church. No Satanists meet in the basements of churches. No one possessing interesting occult secrets would ever meet in the basement of a church. He sighed and resigned himself to an evening of social awkwardness and boredom. The basement had multiple meeting rooms, and he found his way by following signs indicating Second Dawn, Room 6. The signs had arrows drawn on them, showing the correct direction to Room 6. These were very helpful signs, but also one more indication that he was in for a boring evening. Satanists didn't draw helpful direction arrows. The cool Satanists didn't anyway. The door to the meeting room was closed, but through the window he could get a glimpse of what was going on inside. He peered in and saw that the room was arranged with a podium at the far end, and chairs set up in rows facing it, as though there would be a speech from the front. No one was sitting in the chairs or standing at the podium. The few people in the room were milling about and chatting near a sideboard where drinks and snacks were laid out. There were only 7 people in the room, so the amount of chairs facing the podium seemed to be overly optimistic. All 7 could sit in the front row. Bernard was disappointed to see that the 7 people in the room were substantially older than he was, with the youngest looking to be around 30 and the majority being in their 40s and early 50s. All of this might have discouraged Bernard if not for 2 other details he saw through the window. 1. Each one of the attendees was wearing robes, honest to goodness robes. Each of the robes was slightly different, with different trim colors or details, bringing an amount of occult significance to the vestments. Bernard saw these and could not help but think that at least these old crackpots wore cool threads. 2. The book he saw one of the people carrying. It was no ordinary book. It was a thick, leather-bound monster of a book that looked very old. The book was not printed, but hand-written. These 2 things convinced him they might be worth an hour or 2 of his time. Bernard took the plunge and went to his first meeting of the Society of the Second Dawn of Mankind. The Second Dawners, as he later found out they called themselves, all turned around and looked at Bernard when he opened the door. They stood there seemingly stunned that anyone new had come to the meeting, some with their mouths still open in mid-word. Bernard was about to turn around and leave again, just to get away from the embarrassing situation, when the older man holding the interesting book spoke up. "Well, that's a fine welcome for our new lad, isn't it?" His voice was dripping with sarcasm. Come in, come in. Don't mind these lollygaggers, lad. They won't bite you." The old man had a vaguely British accent that seemed to lean dangerously toward a Scottish brogue. At this, the rest of the Second Dawners closed their mouths and became animated again, some looking ashamed of their previous display and making apologies. The group came forward to greet him, and Bernard was soon surrounded by strangers in robes with their hands extended for handshakes. Old Book Guy, as Bernard thought of him at that time, was not one of those who came forward, and as the mass greeting was beginning, he interrupted it with a harumphing from deep in his throat. He had moved to the podium as the others were moving into mob and greet formation, and was now making to get everyone's attention. "If I can bother you all to take your seats, we'll begin. That is, if you don't mind my interrupting your lynching of the poor new boy." Bernard thanked him in his thoughts. He had been about to bolt again, faced as he was with a wall of robed people surrounding him. He knew they were just trying to be friendly and welcoming, but this experience had helped him to discover that no one reacts well to being surrounded by strangers. This went doubly so when the strangers were wearing robes with hoods pulled up. Everyone was taking seats in the rows of chairs facing the podium, so Bernard took a seat as well, but unlike everyone else, he sat in the last seat of the last row. He thought this would be the best in case he changed his mind again and wanted to leave. The cultists in the first row were watching him as he took his seat. They looked disappointed when he chose to sit all the way at the back and away from them, but he could tell from the looks on their faces that they weren't surprised. Soon everyone was settled and facing the podium, and the meeting began. "Welcome, brethren," said Old Book Guy. "I hereby call this meeting of the Society of the Second Dawn of Mankind to order. Is there any old business to take up before we move to new business?" At this, he looked significantly at a Second Dawner who had a notebook in her lap and a calligraphy pen in her hand. She looked up from her scribbling as she realized she was being called upon to look into the previous meeting's minutes. She paged backwards through the notebook and eventually spoke up in a high girlish voice, a much higher voice than Bernard had expected from her middle-aged, plump frame. William Former still hasn't paid his membership fees for this year." She looked at the cultist Bernard presumed to be the aforementioned William Former when she said this, giving him a peevish look. The addressed cultist shrugged. "I said last meeting, Bernice, that since I hosted the Christmas party last year and I provided snacks and drinks, that I considered that to cover my membership fees. If we'd rented a hall, it would have cost us at least $200, and the snacks and drinks were another 50. That more than covers the 200 I would owe for dues as a Second Circle member." He seemed annoyed to have to point this out again, as though this had been explained many times in the past. Just as Bernice was about to retort angrily back at William, old Book Guy cleared his throat. It seemed to Bernard that old Book Guy had a superpower where he could get everyone's attention when he cleared his throat. Even better, his throat clearing was remarkably loud. Everyone looked to old Book Guy, but he looked at Bernice. "Bernie, we agreed last meeting that we'd accept Billy Former's claims as payment of his dues. You need to let this go." Billy seemed to be smugly satisfied by this until old Book Guy turned toward him. "But Billy boy, and this goes for the lot of ye," he took in the entire group with his gaze, "the new sun help me if any of you try this sort of bullshit again. If ye offer to host the bloody Christmas party at your house, do not then claim your costs. Are we clear?" The group was nodding agreement. This old Book Guy had some serious presence, thought Bernard. Old Book Guy then looked at Bernice again and said, "Now, Bernice, is there any actual outstanding old business?" Bernice looked at her notes again. "Oh, we still haven't booked a meeting hall for the spring observance. William Former Sr. was supposed to be looking into that." She looked at the oldest member of the group, who was sitting beside the other, less senior William Former. The old man, who had evidently not been paying attention, was poked by William Former, Jr., Bernard presumed, and made muttering noises. Junior told Senior that they needed to know if he'd booked a hall for the spring observance. Senior made more muttering noises, unintelligible to Bernard, and, he saw, to anyone else in the hall. Or so he thought. Old Book Guy seemed to follow, and said, "Well, do you think you can get around to it this week, William?" He sounded exasperated, and Bernard thought his accent was slipping more and more toward a Scottish brogue. More sounds that were definitely not speech, as far as Bernard could parse, came out of Senior. Bernard's trained to hear it better, and this is what he thought was said: "Merful, Merkel, Flairn, Borty, Lurg, Blashna." Bernard didn't think this sounded like any language he'd ever heard. No one else other than old Book Guy seemed to know what Senior was saying, and none of them seemed to think this strange. They were looking to old Book Guy as though expecting him to translate. "No, William, I'll not bloody rent Billy's place like we did for Christmas." Senior shrugged and made a sound that Bernard heard as Grundbargel Flargnig. Old Book Guy took this in and seemed to be counting to 10 in his head before saying anything. When he did speak, he addressed Bernice. "Bernice, child, can you please make a note in the minutes that William Former Sr. has failed to locate appropriate premises for our spring observance, and that a new volunteer will be selected to look into this?" He then looked at the second Donners expectantly. William Former, the younger, junior one, made to raise his hand to volunteer, but his hand froze halfway up, and he let it drop when old Book Guy gave him a withering look. The gathered cultists then spent the next few minutes working hard at not meeting old Book Guy's gaze, and shifting in their seats uncomfortably. "Janice should do it," Bernice volunteered brightly. The person Bernard assumed to be Janet looked startled to have been nominated. She was a shockingly thin woman in her late 30s. "You never volunteer for any of the work, Janet," Bernice continued, nodding knowingly at her own notebook as if to indicate that she'd know best since she took the minutes at these meetings. Janet was looking daggers at Bernice, and there might have been a need for old Book Guy to use his throat-clearing power to break up the upcoming argument if Bernard had not spoken up at that moment. The thought had come to him that the thing that would annoy his parents even more than knowing that he had joined some fringe cult was to have that cult hold a ceremony at their home. That concludes the preview. I hope that you enjoyed this, and I hope that this has intrigued you enough to want to take a look at my book itself. Please follow the links below, and I thank you very much for the time you've taken in listening to this. I hope you have a great day.